Trinity Church here. We had a church here in the 9th century. It was a wooden church as far as we know, and in the times, of course, when this area of the world was run by the Danes, part of Mercia. And why the church came down in the 13th century, nobody really knows, but they replaced it with a rectangular stone building in 1210. So what is now the north transept, that bit in front of us there, the bit that comes towards us, that is the north transept, which dates from 1210. The guy in the middle of that stained glass window I was showing you, Robert de Stratford, he found the money to build the nave here, not the stuff above it, but just the ground floor there, and the tower, which has been renovated many times over the years, and a different chancel as well. So it was now a big, dark church. The spire there, Shakespeare would not have known the spire. There was a wooden spire in the 17th century, but that was put in after Shakespeare died. They then replaced it in the 18th century with a stone one, so he wouldn't know anything about that, so we ignore the spire. But the chancel here is the newest part of the building, apart from the spire, and that was replaced in 1500, so it was new 500 years ago. And 20 years before that, these windows were put in. And that makes this church, to be perfectly honest, because you'll see it if you go in today, or any time before next Tuesday, you'll see the sun belting through there, and it just lights up the whole church wonderfully. In fact, my colleague Robert Lister here, who does these walks when I'm not available, who lives just around the corner here, he was married here, being a RSC stalwart. Just when he said "I do," the clouds moved away from the sun, the whole church went full, and he got a round of applause. Being a round of applause saying "I do" is a bit worrying, really, but he did. And Christopher Lumsden, you may or may not know, was his best man. In the best man speech, he said, "Who does your stage management?" Which is brilliant. Awesome. But that church can do that for you. Absolutely wonderful. Now, the things to see, I'm not going to take you in there because you're going to have to do that your own thing. I tell people if they've only got an hour in Stratford, they come down to the Holy Trinity Church because that's where it begins. Shakespeare's story begins and ends just here. So come down and see the church. Some fabulous things. But mainly those clerestory windows, before you go into the chancel, those clerestory windows, you've only got to look at the archways going down the nave, and they're all yellow archways, but just in front of the archways is white stone. The yellow archways are from the 13th century, 1280, and that's when they originally built it, but then the roof used to sit on those archways. So they then decided to put the windows in, they raised the roof, so when you look above your head you've got a 13th century oak from the Forest of Arden sitting, they just raised it. I mean, that's a major engineering feat. They raised it up, having put the windows in, and all the stonework above those arches are white stone because it's 15th century, not 13th century. And so you can see exactly what they did, and those windows, those clerestory windows, are exactly the same windows that were put in 1480, apart from one or two broken for stray pigeons bashing into it. Apart from that, they're exactly the same windows, which is, I think, is wonderful. The rest of the windows are stained glass windows, and they're all Victorian, different eras of Victoriana. It's all stained glass windows, but those ones are 1480, which is absolutely wonderful. And if you get into the chancel, you've got to, I think, students, cost you 50 pence as a student to go in and see the deals. But it's the best 50 pence you'll ever spend. It's 50 pence worth it just to see. This is the 400th anniversary of the King James's Bible. Well, in there is original King James's Bible that was printed in 1611, put in there 2 years later in 1613, and it has never left that building since, apart from 5 days in 1984 when some idiot stole it for a prank. It's now called the Chained Bible, so if you've got the same ideas, take some chain cutters with you, because you won't get it otherwise. It's chained up. So there you go. Remember that. But there's some fabulous things to see in there. I mean, the font where Shakespeare was christened is there. I mean, that's just brilliant. That was missing for ages, but eventually was found in the garden of the Shakespeare Hotel, being used as a cattle trough. So they've got it back in there now. They're looking after it now, I'm very pleased to say. Well, when you go into the chancel, there's the north wall of the chancel there, and on the other side of that north wall, you can't see it from here, but there is a doorway, which doesn't open because it's stoned up at the back there. But in Shakespeare's day, it did open. There was a room that came this way, a building that came this way out of the north wall, called the charnel house, which had a specific purpose. That charnel house was for storing the bones when they reused the graves. In Shakespeare's day, you could reuse graves. What you couldn't do was to destroy the bones. That was sacrilege. In fact, we think that the last scene, the last scene in Romeo and Juliet's probably in the charnel house. The grave digger scene in Hamlet, they are classic example. They were just going to have one. Will's going to be Hamlet next week in the Institute Hall there, and so up comes Yorick's skull, and Horatio, Fellow of Infinite Jest, all that stuff. That's on its way to the charnel house for storage because you weren't allowed to destroy it. I'm very pleased to say, in 1799, a bit late, but they eventually decided that you could actually, it wasn't really so rich to burn all these bones, you could get rid of them. And so they had, across the country, they had massive bone fires, which is where the bonfire comes from. It's a bone fire. It has to be a hotter fire than a normal fire, because otherwise the bones don't burn. So the bone fires are very hot, and we didn't need a charnel house, so it was taken down and stoned up. So, but the doorway is still there, 500-year-old oak doorway is still there. And well, there's plenty of other things when you see that. When you go in there, have a look at the misery cords as well, which are on the hinges. 500. These are Jacobean, 500-year-old, where the choir seats. But of course, they're on a hinge, and the choir had to stand for ages. So they put the seats back, and there's a little sort of pedestal which is perch. So it looked like you were standing, and actually you were sitting. So they were called misery cords. In fact, really good. But we will have lost them if the beautiful carvings underneath them had anything to do with Bible stories, because in the Civil War they would have got in there and they would have destroyed them. Well, they didn't, because it's to do with falconry sometimes, and a bit of heraldry, a bit of Greek myth. There's a wonderful one where there's a woman there with a band across her mouth to stop her talking, because she's obviously a gossip. I mean, just something that's pretty terrible, really. But there you go. It's worth having a look at just for that. So the misery goes. But of course, you're not going to see any of that. You're going to spend your 50p to have a look at Shakespeare's grave, and Shakespeare's buried inside the altar, inside the chancel by the altar, not for being a famous playwright, because they didn't know that. He was buried there because he was a tithe owner here in Stratford. He spent money, £410 I think it was, equivalent of very nearly £1 million, for the right of going around and raising the rents from the corporation property here in Stratford. So because he was a tithe owner, because he raised those rents and kept most of the money himself, we reckon he was making £60 or £70 share profit every year, then he had privileges and responsibilities. One of the responsibilities was making sure the chancel cloth was in good nick. When he died, it was in shreds. It wasn't, so he didn't do that job. But he was allowed to be buried inside the church by the altar, under a marble slab, which said, "Good friends, for Jesus' sake, will bear to dig their task, composed here, best be that man that spares these stones, and cursed be he who moved my bones." If you read Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Will in the World, he suggests that Shakespeare deliberately wrote that to an epitaph himself, because he couldn't bear the thought of spending eternity with Anne Hathaway, because normally you get buried in the same grave. But she's buried on the left-hand side, right next to him, because the curse meant that they were too scared to lift the marble slab to bury her in the same grave. Take that as you want, but we do know she's on the left-hand side and not buried with him. And the rest of the family are buried along there as well, because when he died, the tithe ownership went to John Hall. So John Hall's buried there as well. He has the privilege of doing that. Susanna's there as well. Not Elizabeth, their daughter, nor Judith, because she was back shoot the family, really, married that terrible person, Thomas Paine. So she's not buried there. We're not sure where she was buried. But by the time she died, of course, they're no longer with the tithe owners, because John Hall sold them back to the council for the same amount of money that Shakespeare bought them for. So that's pretty impressive on them, really. So the Shakespeare family are there. So it's all worth having a look at. You don't want to say that. So, and you've got a picture. They've got the statue of Shakespeare as well in the North Wall. Don't forget that. We have that is the original statue, but it has been changed and altered over the years. Luckily, we have a drawing. Sir William Dugdale went round. There's a copy in the Birmingham University Library. He went round drawing all these memorials in churches, and we have that record. And he has a drawing of the Shakespeare Memorial. No suggestion that he's a playwright. There's no quill, there's no paper or anything. It's just him sitting on a woolsack, looking very grumpy. But they knew 100 years later, and that was put up, of course, was when Anne Hathaway still hadn't died. John and Susanna Hall were still alive, so we're pretty certain that's what Shakespeare looked like. But